Welcome to the 29th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Stephen Polansky, author of the new novel, The Bradbury Report.
Well, this is Jeffrey Deaver, author of, most recently, The Burning Wire, and soon to be author of the next continuation James Bond novel. I spend a lot of time writing, a lot of time researching my books, but when I'm not doing that, I love listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast, which you can hear at readingandwritingpodcast.com.
Well, welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Stephen Polansky, author of the new novel, The Bradbury Report, and it's in bookstores now. Stephen, welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, your new book, The Bradbury Report, your new novel, imagines an America where cloning is widespread. However, as you wrote in a new Huffington Post article, your primary interest with The Bradbury Report wasn't necessarily cloning and kind of scientific speculation. So I'm curious, what did drive your passion for the novel?
Well, this is a very complicated question for me, and I want to, because I have trouble being honest about it. I want to say that my principal interest was what I take to be. I'm certainly not alone in having this as a principal interest. As I understand novelists and what they're interested in, my interests are not in any way peculiar or unique. I'm interested in human relationships. I'm interested in things like love and friendship and honor and betrayal and death. But when you start naming these things like this, they sound kind of canned and trivial. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that drives me to write and in my writing. Though let me just qualify this, and I apologize for qualifying so early on in the conversation, but no writer worth his or her salt, and I'll qualify that. Any of these general pronouncements are usually suspect. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that most writers don't start out thinking, I'm going to write a book about honor, I'm going to write a book about love, I'm going to write a book about betrayal. They think about a very particular, localized, focused situation that involves 1, 2, 3, however many people that are involved. They put those people in the pot, bring it to a boil, try to keep the lid on it as long as they can, and whatever larger thematic kind of resonance the book or the story has is not incidental, but I think it's very unwise or even misguided to start with a kind of thematic intention and then somehow build a story or a novel around that. So what I was interested in the writing of the book, once I stumbled upon, and it was absolutely a stumble, once I stumbled upon the concept, broadly speaking, of human cloning, I was interested to see, given that, using that as a given, as a kind of circumstance, what might happen to 2 or 3 people caught in the web of it in one way or another, and what might it like to try to be human and loving and decent and reasonable in those kinds of circumstances.
Right. You say you stumbled. Does that make any sense? Yeah, it does. It does. You said you stumbled upon it. What was that process like? I know that many writers hate the question. Where do you get your ideas? But it sounds like you have somewhat identified that you kind of discovered the concept of cloning. I wonder what was that? How did you do that, and what was that like?
Well, I don't know if you've ever read Henry James' prefaces to the 1910 edition. Do you know this? You know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure if I do, but
at
enlighten
the end
me.
It's worth knowing about. And at the end of his life in 1910, the publisher in New York decided to put together a complete edition of Henry James's novels, stories, travel writings, etc. And they asked him if he would write a preface to each volume. And in the preface, would he speak first in every preface to where the idea came from, what was the germ of the story. So if you read through these prefaces, which are, to my mind, the best single text for a writer who's wanting to know what writing is all about, they're collected in a volume called Art of the Novel, which scandalously is out of print. But in any case, if you read through this collection of prefaces, he tells you exactly when he hit upon the subject for The Ambassadors or Wings of the Dove or Turn of the Screw. And, they're all very interesting, but by the end of it, you don't believe a word that he said. I mean, I'm not sure that ideas come that consistently and that neatly wrapped. Right. But this one didn't come neatly wrapped. I have two grown sons, both of whom are smarter than I am, and both of whom I trust, whose taste I trust very much. And we were walking in Central Park and talking about all sorts of things, very few of them having to do with my writing, which is not a subject they want to get me going on. And I don't know who brought the subject of human cloning up, except that I know it wasn't me, because before that moment, I had no special interest in the subject and knew about it, what anyone who is reasonably thoughtful knows about it, maybe a touch less. Now, I don't keep a notebook. I really should. I'm embarrassed to say, and it's probably not a good idea for a writer not to keep a notebook. I keep copious notes when I'm working on a project for that particular project, but I don't have a notebook that I can go to when I'm out of ideas to find an idea that I had 15 years ago and see if I could, resurrect it.
Right.
But I do know, and this is half true, I do know when an idea is good. I do know that an idea is good when I can't shake it. And for whatever reason, this idea stayed with me for weeks, and I was resistant. I was really resistant because the idea I had, the fundamental concept was old man meets his young clone. So as it is transposed in the book, it's a 66-year-old man who spends a year on the run with an identical replica of himself at 21 years old, which, I not so cleverly claim is a form of time travel, and maybe the only possible form of time travel that we'll ever know, despite what Stephen Hawking is now saying. But in any case, here's a 66-year-old man seeing himself again, being in the presence of himself again at 21. And I thought, well, this is a wonderfully productive concept. But the possibilities are lovely. But the concept itself, I was for a long time afraid would be such a high concept, the kind of concept you could pitch to a movie studio in 3 sentences, and walk out with the deal, that I wouldn't be able to get out from under it, that the concept would rule the book rather than my starting from there and making something unexpected and moving and very human out of it. I certainly didn't want it to devolve into car chases and high-tech espionage and so I was resistant, and it was only, and I don't know into how much detail I should go, but it was only when I added to that mix of two a third character who is a 66-year-old woman. Her name is Anna in the book. She's a woman with whom the main male character, actually all 3 of them share the stage pretty much equally. The man who writes the book, who writes the report that is the book that we read, goes by the alias Ray Bradbury. he is 66, she is 66, and they knew each other 45 years before in graduate school in Iowa. They were both studying to be teachers. They had a kind of vexed relationship, vexed in the sense that she had fairly strong feelings for him, and he was kind of oblivious and a cad and just a 21-year-old male. And they hadn't seen each other in 45 years. In the interim, she'd gotten married and had a wonderful life with her husband, who's recently died, and he married the love of his life, who died after 7 years of marriage, and from whose death he never recovered. In any case, they are thrown together again with this copy of this man who is now 21 years old, the copy. And so she is between these two men, one of whom is 66, the man she loved when she was 22, now old as she is now, or elderly as she is now elderly, and a version of him, the version of him, that she fell in love with first 45 years before. She loves them both, differently, obviously. And once I found the third element, I said, okay, now I've got a book that I'm interested in. And I don't have to think too much about the scientific basis of cloning or, cellular reprogramming. I can think about human relationships again.
The humanity behind it.
Yeah. Was that coherent?
Yes, it was. It was.
Okay. And let me just say this, having said that, having sort of detailed or not detailed, adumbrated the plot of this book, I'm aware that it sounds ludicrously contrived and coincidental and implausible. In a world with 250 clones and 250 people who have been cloned, the likelihood that, and where clones never appear in the world, that is to say, they're not allowed out. People are not meant to think, see, meet, wonder about their clones until they're needed for spare parts. The likelihood that a clone would somehow escape and wind up connected to his original, the man from whom he was cloned, is statistically zero. But I always think, as a novelist, that one of the best jobs, the best opportunities we have when we write our books is to take the most unlikely thing and somehow, and it doesn't always work, and when it doesn't, it's a disaster, somehow make it inevitable, not only plausible, but inevitable. And I can't judge whether I've done that in this book, but I hope I have.
Right. I know that, as you just said, that your focus was certainly not on the high concept or the delving deeply into the science behind cloning, that it was more about the humanity of the situation that presented itself. But I'm curious, in the research that you did do, where do you think cloning is headed in the near future?
Well, this is an interesting question, and if you've read the Huffington Post, you know that the piece that I did for them, you know that I acknowledge in that piece that my disclaimer about cloning and where my real interest lies in the book is somewhat disingenuous, because finally the book is about cloning, and it does engage in whatever debate there is. There's not much of a debate anymore about cloning. It seems to have been, well, I mean, there's so much going on and so much serious stuff, and cloning seems to have been backgrounded significantly. But, the debate is essentially, there are any reasonable discussion of cloning it recognizes two different kinds of cloning. One is broadly called therapeutic, which we know as the use of stem cells harvested from existing embryos or cloned embryos, and you use them, you incur, these are non-specialized cells that have the unique ability to turn into any kind of cell that you need, and if you can find a way to get them to turn into liver cells or pancreas cells or heart cells, then you have a compatible organ to give to the person who needs it, and that would, and there's fairly lively debate about this kind of human cloning. You remember George Bush was adamantly against it.
Right.
And when Obama was elected, only days after his inauguration, he lifted Bush's interdiction on stem cell research in the use of disease, in the treatment of disease. And so the international community is broadly divided on the use of stem cells for health practice or treatment of disease. There's almost no debate on what's called reproductive cloning, which is taking a hair cell or a skin cell and using the DNA to develop an entire organism identical to the one from whom you've taken the original cell. Here's the thing. It is arguable that since we can develop the organs we need, or presumably develop and I suspect we will be able to do this in short order, and in some cases we're doing it already. Since we can develop what we need from stem cells, and since we can clone embryos and then harvest the stem cells from those embryos, why on earth would we ever turn to the inarguably obscene practice of cloning entire human beings from scratch? And to answer your question, and I've come a long way, I don't think it's medical need, as I say in the Huffington Post piece, that will drive us. I think it's the way in which cloning full-blown human beings can satisfy extra medical, non-medical needs that will drive us. These are perceived needs. I don't think they're real needs, but they're perceived needs that people will have. And the fact that the potential for profit for any entity, be it government, as in my book, or private enterprise, that can satisfy these needs through cloning, the profit will be so enormous that once this kind of reproductive cloning is possible, and it may well be somewhere already possible, and if it's not already possible, it will soon be possible. I think once it's possible, it will happen because it is possible, and also because of the way in which it will satisfy what I'm calling perceived needs. You want me to give you some examples?
Sure, I think so.
Would that be useful?
I think so.
Okay, let me give you the example with which you and I and your listeners will be able to most easily sympathize. You're a young couple. You're having difficulty getting pregnant. You've gone through all the fertility tests and clinics, and you've tried in vitro, and it doesn't work. And so you're offered this option. You can go to a clinic that specializes in cloning, and you can look through a catalog, brochure, whatever, an index, which lists the originals that you can make a copy of, that you can give birth to and raise from infancy, and you choose the child that most appeals to you, and then either you bear that child or some surrogate bears that child, or I suppose it's possible to raise that child in a test tube as well and then implant it somewhere. But in any case, you wind up with a child that of your choice, not just what color eyes or what color hair, but the child. You have a very sure sense of what it's going to be because it's a copy of something that already exists or did exist, and you raise that child as your own. And it seems to me that that's the most justifiable use, non-medical use, or broadly speaking, non-medical use of reproductive cloning. Though, if you think about it, what might well happen is, depending on your values, what you prize most highly, you could imagine somebody who prized a couple that valued most highly physical beauty, looking at themselves and saying, if we have our own child, this is not, let's say, a couple that necessarily can't have children.
Right.
But decide not to because the child that they will get is not likely to be the child that they want. And why take the child you get when you can have the child you want? And so you go to the same clinic and you choose to clone Scarlett Johansson. And you raise Scarlett Johansson. You call her something else, Sylvia Cudahy, but you raise Scarlett Johansson as your child, though she is Scarlett Johansson's parents' child, Scarlett Johansson's twin, however far removed they are in age. And let's say, 10,000 other people in the country value the same thing, and I think it would be more than 10,000 who value physical beauty above all else.
And that's certainly scary given our celebrity culture these days.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine. You can imagine. But there are more nightmarish ones. Let me just give you one really, let me give you a kind of ambiguous one, and you tell me what you think. Let's say you have a child that you adore. He's 8 years old, and he's killed in some terrible accident. And now you're bereft. He was your first and only child. And you want to have another child, but you want to have that child again. So it will be distinctly possible to clone people that are deceased loved ones. You would raise them from infancy again. The clones don't come out fully formed. They're infants. They're neonates. And so you would raise your child from scratch, a replacement for the one you lost. And, I have 3 children, and I've tried to imagine what it would be like to lose one. I think it would be unsurvivable. But let's say I did survive, and then I got the chance to raise that child again. I can only imagine that I would miss the first one more than I ever did, if that makes any sense.
Oh, it does. It does. I have 2 kids, so I certainly, that's definitely a conundrum that I think most parents, first of all, never want to face, but if they did, it would certainly be a dilemma.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic and I'm also horrified. And, when I think about it, I wonder what it does for our sense of the family. For instance, if I can raise my father from infancy, or I can raise my dead wife from infancy so that when she's 20, I'm 80. What exactly is our relationship? Well, how would one describe, are we married? Are we man and wife? Are we father and daughter? We're neither. We're essentially strangers who once were related but are no longer. I mean, the whole all our language, our lexicon for human relationships is skewed, thwarted, and we'd have to develop a whole new language, I think, to talk about the way in which we are related to other people, and we'd also have to develop a whole new language for talking about the self. What on earth would the self mean if I could clone myself 20 times? I could perpetuate. Right. I could perpetuate me and not my line. When I started thinking about this, I got very nervous and worried. I think because the appeal will be so great and because the profit will be so great, those two things, you put them together and you have an almost unstoppable, inexorable kind of proposition. And, one would hope that the government would get ahead of this and regulate it in the most strenuous way, which I think they probably will try to do. But when you think about it, all it would take would be one country unwilling to regulate it or eager to profit from it, and the jig would be up.
That's certainly some bizarre scenarios to speculate on, without a doubt.
But scientifically possible. I mean, that's the thing. This is not science fiction. It's just, it will in 10 years be science fact. And I can't predict what will happen or what we'll do with it. I have my own hopes, but I'm not altogether optimistic.
Sure. I'm curious, given that, as you mentioned earlier, there's a character in the novel that's obviously a nod or an homage to Ray Bradbury. Do you know if he's actually seen the book?
Well, here's what I do know. I had never read Ray Bradbury until I decided to use his name for this character, and my character who takes his name has never read him. So I try to be honest in that way. I did read him once I decided to use his name, and then I wrote him through his agent, and then I sent him a copy of the book, and in the book, right up top in my acknowledgments, I apologized to him for appropriating his name and make it clear that it was meant to be an homage and not an exploitation. Now, I haven't heard from him, and for all I know, he doesn't care one way or the other. And if I were him, I wouldn't care either. So,
right. As I mentioned, the Bradbury Report is a novel, but you've also had short stories published in a variety of publications, including the New Yorker and the annual Best American Short Stories anthology. Do you have a preference between writing short stories or novels?
I'm afraid I have the most decided preference. I was a short story writer for the first 10 or 12 years of my writing life. Of those, in those 10 years, I published maybe 12 or 13 stories, 9 of which were collected in the book Dating Miss Universe that came out in 2000, which did quite well. It won a number of pretty significant awards, and I was pleased with the volume. But I have to tell you, I find writing short stories just really unbearable. I found it so painful, so tense. I find the form. Now, I'm only speaking of myself. For me, it's like suffering from constipation. I feel so constrained and so nervous. They're so delicate and so easy to wreck with one false move or one false sentence. And the pressure just finally got to me, and I'm so slow when I write a short story. So a story would take me 6 months, and I calculated that I could write a novel in the time it would take me to write 4 stories, which turns out not to be quite true. I can write a novel somewhere between 2 or 3 years because I'm steady, but I'm slow. So I just gave it up. I don't even like to read them much anymore, Jeff. I mean, there are stories that I return to over and over again, and I admire any number of contemporary short story writers, but I don't envy them the form.
Sure. I know that you taught writing for many years. What advice do you offer to aspiring writers who may be listening?
Well, I want to be really careful about this. I think when a writer starts talking about the way he works and holding it up as a kind of model or an example of the way one might work, I think it's really dangerous. My thought is that a writer, if he or she is going to be a writer, has got to discover for him or herself the way in which I hate to do all these he or she works best, and forget about what other writers say about their working habits or methods. So that would be my first advice: is to find your own rhythms, your own what works for you best.
Figure out what works for you.
Yeah, and don't covet what you hear other writers say about their work. I mean, when a writer says he works from 8 till 5 every day, first, I don't believe it, and second, if it's true, it's not the way I can work. I wouldn't get anything done after the first 3 hours because I'd be so blasted. I'd barely be able to speak. So, I mean, I think you have to discover for yourself the way you work and be wary of this kind of. It's not platitudinous, but it's facile advice. The second thing the only other thing I can say is, when I taught writing students, and I taught them at all levels, from freshmen in college to MFA students, really aspiring writers who aspired to be professionals, I was astonished and dismayed to see how little they'd read. And though it's possible, I imagine, to emerge, to make your career out of whole cloth and not have read anything, to be a kind of noble savage, it seems to me that the surer way, and certainly the more interesting way, is to read as much of the literature that precedes you as you can, and maybe not so much, which is the temptation, of the literature that is contemporary with you, because that can be daunting and discouraging, and also, I think, too powerful a kind of influence. There are writers, for instance, you know this as well as I do, in each generation there are writers who seem to determine the way fiction is written for 5 or 6 years, and editors all over the country say things like, "I like your story, I only wish it were more Carver-esque." And so you want to be careful. There are always strong writers around whose voice, if not imitatable, is at least suggestible or suggestive. And if you are suggestible, then you get into trouble. So I think it's safer and finally more interesting to read, Ford, Maddox Ford and earlier, rather than sort of be au courant and up to date on everything that comes out from Jonathan Lethem and Michael Chabon, even though these guys are terrific. They're terrific. But they didn't get to be terrific, I suspect, by, following the trends.
Sure. And you just mentioned that some of your students were not as widely read as you would have hoped that they would be. If you had a student who came to you and said, what should I read? You just mentioned Ford, Maddox Ford, and before him, do you have other authors that you would recommend or that you enjoy reading?
Well, yeah, I do. I did a PhD in English at Princeton, so I went through the whole canon, sort of piece by piece. And the books that moved me and influenced me profoundly are not likely to, or certainly not necessarily going to be the books that work that way for other people. But
sure.
And any writer I would mention, I would regret not mentioning another one tomorrow. So I'm reluctant to do it. I suppose the writer that I would live and die by, that I would have no qualms recommending to anyone, is Henry James. And I would say that, to the vast majority of the people to whom I recommended him, he would be insufferable and unreadable. And I don't. That's not a value judgment on my part. It's just a description. And so then, if that person came to me and said, "I can't read this stuffy, ponderous, punctilious guy," I would listen and then find another writer to replace James with that might speak more nearly to that writer. But
do you have a sense? Is Henry James being read today? What's your gut?
Oh, sure. Though I think in the classes where I've tried to teach him, I've resorted, and I've always felt guilty about this. I've resorted to teaching the shorter pieces, Daisy Miller, the old chestnut turn of the screw that everybody uses in their classrooms because it's so easy to teach, not because it's particularly great, but any idiot could teach that book to students who hadn't read it before. But I'm reluctant, to try to teach Wings of the Dove, for instance, to a class that had never read James. It would shut the semester down. And it'd be like teaching Ulysses, which I've done. But when I've done it, I've taught that book and only that book for the semester.
Right. Well, what's next for you? Are you working on another novel now?
Yeah, I'm always, sadly, I mean, I'm just, at a certain point, it's like the like running. If I don't write on any given day, and I'm not saying I spend 8 hours doing it, if I don't spend a couple of hours at least looking at the pages and thinking about what I might do when I start writing, then I feel like a bum. I feel like I have no purpose, no use, and in between books, I think about a book before I start to write it for a long time,
mm-hmm.
and in between books, I've got a novel being what do you call it? Agented. An agent is trying to sell one of my novels that's finished, and I'm about 300 pages into another one. So I'm fairly productive, but I need a lot of time between novels to think and take notes on my thoughts and have a conversation with my notes, and then have another conversation until the book feels complicated enough for me, so that and I thought deeply enough about it, so that I'm ready to start. Not that I know everything about it, and not that everything I thought isn't subject to change, but in that interval, from the time I quit writing one and start writing another, it gets to the point where I'm dangerous to those I love. And, if I don't start writing soon, I'd have to move out, because I get so edgy and bewildered. And I don't know if anybody else has had that experience. I suspect they have.
I'm sure they have. Well, again, we've been speaking with Stephen Polansky, author of the Bradbury Report. His new novel is available in bookstores now. Thanks, Stephen.
Jeff, thank you.
This is Lee Child, and I'm listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks for listening to my latest interview. If you like what you heard, I would really appreciate a review of the podcast in iTunes. It's really simple. All you have to do is go to the iTunes store, and it takes a minute or two to leave a quick review of the podcast. And that way more people can find the podcast, because the more reviews and ratings a podcast has in the iTunes store, the more they feature it and the more prominently they feature it. So hope you enjoyed the interview. Until next time, read some good books and support your local independent bookstore, and I'll be back soon with another interview with a writer that you enjoy reading.